Hi, and welcome to the 64th in our series on Middle Eastern history. Today, we're going to cover Israel in its post-independence period. This is a conversation that we're going to begin tonight. We're definitely going to continue into next week. And given how much interest there is, there's probably going to be a lot of questions. So it may even go into the first week of March. So let's get into the rules for those who are unfamiliar. Now, the rules are this. This is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing tonight. And I'm going to try and deliver this as a secular presentation, meaning that I'm not going to try and prejudice in favor of one side or the other side in a particular war, in a particular combat, try and provide an objective historical analysis of what's going on. The next thing is that, of course, this is going to be a difficult topic. So let's be respectful as we are in all of the other presentations. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. What I like to say is these classes or these presentations are 101s and 201s, meaning that if you don't know anything, trust me, I'll catch you up. And if you already know something, I will probably tell you things that you didn't know, and that will be your next level of education. I also have what I call a 2-hour hard stop. So at 9 p.m. Eastern time, I'm not going to advance any more slides. Those slides that remain will be the discussion for next week, and we will go to the Q&A afterwards. You won't miss anything because it will start with the next week with all those remaining slides. Now, any dates that I put below a person are typically their years of service if they're a politician. But if they are a philosopher or an ideologue, those will be their years of life. Now, this other entrants in the Middle Eastern and Islamic history series are going to be recorded. You can find those on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to see all of the various presentations that we do. And if you want to be advised of upcoming presentations, we post in a variety of meetups, but this meetup, New York Museum Food, is one that we regularly post in, and all of our events can be found there. So please join that meetup if you want to see all the presentations that our group, History Mostly Ancient Discussions, does. And of course, we have a premium Zoom account, a premium YouTube account, and a premium Meetup account. And in order to keep the lights on, we appreciate any donations that you feel that you should give based on the quality of the content that you're seeing today and other days. Of course, we're going to continue to offer this content for free, so there's no obligation, but please, if you feel that this is something that's improving your life, something that's interesting, it helps us in order to get the message out. All right, so on to Israel. We discussed in episodes 55 and 56 how Jewish theology existed through much of the last 2 millennia, that there was this idea that once you've destroyed the great Jewish temple, which was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, that there was no validity for any creation of a Jewish state without a divine act, a messianic act. And through the 19th century, we begin to see different movements start to create chinks in that armor. You have several of these movements coming from Jewish individuals, and there are others who are non-Jewish individuals. Now, they all have their different motives, but none of these movements is the Zionist movement itself. Some of them are religious, some of them are socio-political, but the Zionist movement really comes about when Theodor Herzl has his revelation at seeing the anti-Semitism of the French government. So eventually, the British tried to seek out Jewish assistance in the UK for the promotion of World War I, and they figure that they'll resolve the differences after the war between what the agreements that they made with the Arabs, right, for the Hussein McMahon correspondence in 1915 with this Balfour Declaration issued in 1917. And the Balfour Declaration was simply 2 parts, that there would be a Jewish national homeland, and that the communities in Palestine, other than the Jews, would not be limited in their rights or political status. When we start getting into the mandatory period and Jews begin to settle, and we discussed this a little bit in episode 55 and 56, you begin to have two differentiating factors among the Jewish community. The first one is whether or not those Jews align as Ashkenazi, being Jews of European heritage, or Sephardi Mizrahi, Jews being of Middle Eastern and North African heritage. And the Jews of Ashkenazi heritage begin to come primarily as non-religious individuals, and so it took some time before a religious leader came to support them. And this was Rav Abraham Kook, who began to come in the 1930s from Russia. He had a very unique Jewish philosophy at that time, which was a philosophy that the Jewish state itself was a secular enterprise. However, that secular enterprise was something that would eventually lead to a religious enterprise, that over time, more and more Jews would become religious. They'd become connected to the religious fabric of the country. And therefore, Israel would begin to move in a more religious direction. And we'll see over the course of these presentations that that view may well have been prophetic. He is often seen as the leader, the spiritual leader of the current religious Zionist movement, the Datei Leumi movement in Israel. On the Sephardic side, you had leaders like Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Uziel, and his goal was to redefine the Sephardic community of Israel, because originally you had what was called the Old Yishuv, the traditional Jewish inhabitants of the country, but they were increasingly outnumbered by the Ashkenazi immigrants, and they achieved parity for a certain extent with the Yemeni immigrants that came in the first Aliyah back in 1905. So he had a number of disparate communities that hadn't been in touch with each other, didn't have a strong united sense of Mizrahi Jewish identity as such, and was trying to create a counterpoint to the increasing Ashkenazi immigration and to preserve the Sephardi culture. And we're going to see a tension between the Sephardi and Ashkenazi communities as Israel develops. So that's one side, the sort of the religious division. On the flip side, you also have an increasing political division. In the beginning days of the state, a lot of the Jews that were coming from Eastern Europe and were connected with the Bund, or the Jewish socialist group. There were a number of different leaders among what were called the Chalutzim, or the Jewish pioneers, who were from this more socialist background. I've chosen Dov Baruchov as the individual to represent them. He was born in Ukraine and immigrated to Israel for a time. Now, this movement was the movement behind the creation of the kibbutz, behind the creation of the larger scale socialist organizations like the Histadrut. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. And this is the organization that's really going to guide the organization of these socialist-leaning Jewish populations, is going to lead the development of Israel in the early part of its post-independence period. On the other side, you have Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky, who's probably the first major leader of revisionist Zionism. Jabotinsky was leading this movement that saw that a relationship with the Arabs in the long term was not going to be viable. In his view, in order to be able to have a state, the Jews would have to take a more militaristic approach. They'd have to be a more traditional approach in terms of geopolitics, which meant that he was more right-wing in the Western understanding of that term. Hawkish on defense, certainly, but also right-wing on economic factors. He didn't see the long-term viability of the kibbutz system, and he didn't see the long-term viability of any of the activities that were going on during the socialist period. And I mentioned the Histadrut before, and it's worth taking a second to discuss what this is, because this is an organization that still exists in Israel today. It has 800,000 members at present. And despite being substantially weakened from when it was originally formed. And the Histadrut was a massive national labor union that would bring together Israelis from all of the major sectors of the economy. A number of companies whose employees are members of the Histadrut include SIM. SIM is a famous organization that creates shipping containers. You have Mapai Coalition, or the Activists Bank, which is one of the four major banks of Israel. You have Shikun Binui, or Solel Boneh. Both of these are organizations related to construction and building. You have the Medical Services of Israel, the Klalit. All of these organizations have a massive labor union that is state operated, meaning that Israel is one of the few countries in the world that actually practices a certain degree of socialist control of labor unions. And this was started during the labor Zionist period in the pre-modern state. So we then have this Declaration of Independence that takes place. And we talked in episodes 55 and 56 about all of the forces that led up to it. But if we follow through the war, we have a number of areas of Jewish settlement and a number of areas of Arab settlement. But if you see, the Jewish settlement tends to be incredibly concentrated along the northern coast, in some areas around the Sea of Tiberias. We have some areas close to the city of Haifa, but you can see that the majority of the country doesn't have significant Jewish population. Now, to be fair, a majority of the country also does not have significant Arab population. But if you look at the division proposed by the UN General Assembly in 1947, the area of the Jewish state does have a significant percentage of Arabs inside of it. And so the Arab state was almost exclusively non-Jewish, but the Jewish state was almost 50-50 Arabs and Jews. Despite this, Israel is able to be victorious in the war in several key battle positions, and we talked about these battles in episodes 56 and 57. Suffice to say, the enemies of Israel were not able to defeat it. This led, of course, to a massive demographic shift within Israel, and the demographic shift goes in two directions. So let's talk about the outflow, and then we'll talk about the inflow. Prior to independence, the population of Mandatory Palestine was roughly 600,000 Jews and 1.2 million Arabs. During the War of Independence, Israel removed a number of villages, a number of townships, and this resulted in the expulsion of a number of Palestinians. Now, there is a degree to which Palestinians fled villages in advance of Israeli soldiers. That certainly happened. Some argue that those flights were precipitated by previous attacks on other villages, and some argue that those were in response to Arabs who had gone on the radio saying, "Move out of the way, we'll defeat the Zionists, you can come back later." Regardless, the scale of the Israeli atrocities was actually quite low, in that most of the destruction of these towns and villages happened after the war. It happened during the early 1950s, as the Israeli government reappropriated the land after the Palestinian population that left did not return and was not allowed by the Israeli government to return. You have different reactions from what I'm going to call the Palestinian citizens of Israel, those who stayed. So of the 1.2 million Palestinian Arabs who lived in the Mandate of Palestine before the war, 720,000 to 780,000, depending on how you count them, fled to countries outside of Israel. Some of them are internally displaced because they went to the West Bank or Gaza. Some of them are externally displaced. They went to Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and some countries further afield. Another about 500,000 or so, it's hard to get the exact number because population estimates weren't taken very readily, were individuals who already lived in the areas of the West Bank or Gaza, and therefore weren't expelled from their homes or fled and didn't flee their homes. They were still living in their homes. Those homes just didn't happen to be part of any Palestinian state because Jordan annexed the West Bank and Egypt created a puppet government in Gaza. So this resulted in there being a roughly 100,000 remaining Arabs under Israeli control. And so these Palestinian citizens of Israel had a number of choices as to how they were going to interact with the now Jewish majority. You have those like Saifuddin Zu'bi, who worked with a number of the labor Zionists and helped form one of the first Arab list parties. He was included in the Israeli government in the first Knesset, although many Arabs living in Israel doubt how much independence of thought these Arab political parties have, and argue that they didn't really represent Palestinian citizens of Israel's aspirations in terms of the development. Of course, there were other individuals who were less willing to cooperate with the new state of affairs. And one of these I've chosen to bring out is Tawfiq Ziyad. Tawfiq Ziyad was a Palestinian poet. He was a citizen of Israel, and he, on many occasions, wrote poetry and made speeches denouncing the state of Israel and its treatment of its Palestinian citizens. To put into context what he's talking about, from 1949 until 1966, Palestinian citizens of Israel were under martial law. So they were required to live in their cities. There are specifically cities that were designated as Arab cities, like al-Fahm or Afula. There were some mixed cities like Haifa or Akko, but the majority of cities in which Arabs lived were Arab cities, and they were subject to additional militarized regulations. Tawfiq Ziyad, by using poetry, was resorting to a typical Arab form of expression. We've seen throughout this series that poetry is an almost consistent form among Arabs to criticize governments that they deem unjust, even when those governments, and especially actually when those governments are ruled by Muslims. Tawfiq Ziyad was arrested by the Israeli government on several occasions. He alleges that he was beaten, and he did not survive much past the 1960s because of, in his own view, the violence that he endured. If we talk about the inflow, you then have reciprocal actions throughout the Arab world. Now, as we pointed out, many of these actions were contingent on the local policies and issues going on in those countries, rather than some natural response to Israel's successes in the war. Many countries used Israel's success in the War of Independence as justification for their expulsion of the Jewish population. Now, that expulsion could come in many different forms. The first form of this kind of expulsion was a increasing difficulty for Jews to maintain their lives in Middle Eastern countries. For example, they would be prohibited from going to their jobs. They would have their reputation sabotaged. They would be limited to certain areas of a city. They'd have to dress in a certain way. They wouldn't be able to connect with the aristocracy if they had a tradition of doing that, such as the Jews in Tunisia did. So you had this population that was itching to get out because the situation that they were in was one that was deeply repressive towards their being, and Israel made it clear that there was a place for them. Some of these people came through their own means. A perfect example of this is, generally speaking, Iraq. From 1950 to 1952, after Iraq repealed a law forbidding Jews from leaving the country, it was argued that Jews might take state secrets from Iraq to Israel, although what state secrets Jews would have known was never made explicit by the Iraqi government. These Jews from 1950 to 1952 took flights from Iraq to Iran, and then Iran at that time, which was an ally of the nascent state of Israel, had flights between Tehran and Tel Aviv. That's how those Jews would typically arrive in Israel. And the vast bulk of the Iraqi Jewish community is in Israel now, exactly for that reason. Other Jews didn't have the means to escape. A perfect example were the Yemeni Jews, who had no access to transportation. And so the Israeli government flew a number of missions to Yemen in order to pick up these Jews in the dead of night, get them onto planes, and bring them to Israel. There's a question here about the Arabs in Israel, if they faced economic sanctions or additional taxes. They faced some economic pressure in what property they could purchase and in how they could organize their wills and trusts and things like that. But generally speaking, they didn't receive economic sanctions as such or additional taxes simply for being Arab Muslims. Another group that was brought in from overseas were the Ethiopians, and Israel ran a number of flights to Ethiopia in order to bring the Ethiopian Jewish community to Israel, and the bulk of the Ethiopian Jewish community now is in Israel. It should be made clear that the Jewish population at the end of the War of Independence was 600,000 people. An additional 500,000 Jews entered the country between 1950 and 1957. There was simply nowhere to put them. A number of the old Palestinian villages had been destroyed during the same time, and it didn't make sense necessarily from the perspective of the Israeli government at the time to put these new Jews in houses that had been effectively confiscated from the Palestinians who had fled. And so instead, in the large deserts of the Israeli south, they created tent camps called ma'aborot. And there are some Jewish families that allege that they had spent at least 7 years in these camps before being settled by the Israeli government. So what was the Israeli government that was operating from 1949 until, let's say, the mid-1960s? This was a government that was run by the labor Zionists. We discussed when we talked about Dov Ber-Baruchov, these kinds of individuals. They came behind a single large-scale leader that was David Ben-Gurion. And Ben-Gurion was the first prime minister of the state of Israel. And he created the Mapai Coalition. Mapai being because Labor never won any election outright. They never had over 50% of the seats in the Knesset. And so they had to govern in coalition with a number of other labor Zionist parties. The name of that coalition is Mapai. So what were sort of the hallmarks of this government? There are a few. The first one, as we pointed out, is sort of the inverse of what we saw with the Mizrahi arrival in Israel. Namely that you had the creation and mass production of construction in order to house this new 500,000 person population, this new 83% population increase. You had massive building throughout the country and the creation of all new towns and cities for these new Jews to settle in. You also had the promulgation of the kibbutz. Now, the kibbutz was less popular among the Mizrahi Jews, and so it was generally Ashkenazi Jews who tended to live there. And we should take a second to talk about what a kibbutz is and how it works. So a kibbutz is a small township, and I say that in the sense of it has all of the things that a town would have, like town squares, a park, a school, medical facilities, or if it doesn't have medical facilities itself, maybe it has a clinic. So and houses for all the different families. So you have these fundamental aspects of a township, but it is a township under a socialist model. And that means that you have all of the children being raised in one group, and they're being stewarded by one of the families that maintains all of those children together. It's actually interesting because there have been a number of studies on attractiveness that have been done using the children raised in kibbutzim, because a lot of them exhibit the same natural disgust towards having a possible romantic relationship with individuals who they are not biologically related to, but grew up in the same creche as they did, as they would if they had biological relation. But so you have all these kids growing up together and stewarded by one set of parents. Another set of the parents organizes the activities, and all of the township participates in whatever the production is of that group or township. I chose here actually Kibbutz Sde Boker, which was Ben-Gurion's pet project. He lived there for the last years of his life. And it's a kibbutz in the Negev desert, the southern desert in Israel. And for him, he believed that the future of the Jewish state was one where the desert itself was colonized. From this, we get the common Israeli expression to make the desert bloom. But it wasn't just a simple aphorism that Ben-Gurion had that he wanted to make the desert bloom. He actually began policies designed to promote that. And one of these policies was the creation of the national water carrier. You can see the size of the pipes as they're being assembled in 1964 in the lower right-hand side. And these pipes would channel water from the Sea of Galilee in Israel's northeast all the way down its coastline and into the desert region. This was the primary way that Israel was able to feed its population through the growth of plants based on agriculture based on that water, and also to give its citizens enough water to drink, replacing a lot of the previous structure. But Israel's economy during this period, aside from the small products made in the kibbutzim, was highly organized by the state as well. In particular, we should look to Pinchas Sapir, who was the Minister of Finance at certain points and the Minister of Trade and Industry at other points. If the years overlap, and you can see that they do, that's because he held both portfolios at the same time. He was particularly known for having his little black book. And in his little black book, he would organize all of the different industries that were investing in Israel. Basically, if you didn't get a meeting with Pinchas Sapir, you would not get funding. You would not be able to access the country. And Sapir was particularly interested in galvanizing foreign investment in Israel in order to build out Israeli industry. But that industry would be entirely state-guided. For those who have been following the series, this sounds very similar to Devletçilik in Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's Turkey, where the state again controlled all of the levers towards the creation of a modern nation state. One of the things to point out here, and we sort of mentioned it when we talked about Saifuddin Zu'bi a few slides ago, is that Mapai thought that it was incredibly important to demonstrate that the Arabs were a constituent part of Israeli society. And so you can see on the left-hand side, this is actually a campaign poster for the creation of Arab political parties that were aligned with Mapai, and for the election of those parties. During the 1950s, however, the borders of Israel were not safe from the perspective of there were numerous crossings of those borders, illegal crossings of those borders. And to make matters worse, a number of the Arab cities that were under military patrol, because remember, the Arabs were under martial law throughout the 1950s, were along the border with the West Bank. And so you had a number of cases where cities, Arab towns along the border with the West Bank had curfews. You had a number of other personal restrictions because of the porousness of the borders. Another point to be made here is that Jordans control the West Bank, put Jordan in a topographically higher position. And so it's easier for people to run down a hill than it is for people to defend the bottom of the hill. One particularly sad incident was in Kfar Qasim. And Kfar Qasim is an Arab town within the state of Israel. The Israeli military police accidentally believed that citizens in the town were part of an invading raid, and we'll talk a little bit about what those raids are like in a second. But they thought that the actual citizens of the town were raiders and shot, I believe, 53 of them. The number might be a little bit more or less. I don't remember the exact number. And you can see here is a memorial in the town square to the martyrs of Kfar Qasim who were killed by Israeli policemen. On the flip side, you have what are called the Fida'i, or the Palestinian militants. And these begin to receive financial support from both Egypt and Jordan and cross the borders into Israel with the intent to attack Israeli civilians and instill both fear and worsen production within Israel. And so Israeli policemen had to continually surveil the border in order to find where these Fida'i had crossed the border. And you can see this is a case in 1956 where the Israeli policemen had killed several Fida'i, and they're trying to inspect them to determine where their funding came from, where they were based, all of these fundamental aspects of their operations within Israel. One of the largest groups of Fida'i in this period is the PFLP, the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine. As you can tell by the name, it's rather left in orientation. They consider themselves Arab socialists. And the PFLP would actually be a huge part of the Palestine Liberation Organization in its early years before fading away as Fatah became the dominant member of the Palestine Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat's leadership. So we begin to see a number of Cold War alliances being made. In 1949 to 1953, one of the things that people often forget is that the Soviet Union was the primary supporter of the State of Israel. And they supported Israel because of all those socialist indicators that I explained earlier, the Histadrut, the labor Zionists, the state control of the economic sphere, the proliferation of the kibbutzim. All of these pointed to an Israeli pro-Soviet, pro-socialist alignment. But increasingly, it looked that Israel was not going to embrace being part of the Soviet sphere and instead had reached out to the West, securing an alliance with France and the UK. That alliance would actually hold until 1967, where the United States began to take the primary role of Israel's foreign benefactor. As the Soviet Union became more and more distant from Israel, you begin to see the Soviet Union beginning to take more and more of the Arab side in the conflict. You can see, for example, Khrushchev and Nasser coming to an agreement in 1955 to fund Nasser's Aswan High Dam, as well as a number of other projects that would eventually lead to Soviet soldiers being on Egyptian soil. There's a question here as to what's the difference between socialism and communism. I would argue that socialism has a number of different policies, and these are related to large-scale welfare. They're related to state-organized labor. Yeah, I think those are the two biggest ones. Communism necessarily, at least ideologically, has a planned economic system, right, where the government chooses what's built and what's not built. Even under Pinchas Sapir, there wasn't a loss of private industry. You could create your own shop if you wanted. In the Soviet Union, that wasn't permitted. I also think that communism has an internationalizing bent. So you have all these sort of differences that exist. But I would say that communism at least tries to implement socialism. It doesn't do it terribly well. Anyway, so within the Cold War sphere, that sort of talks about the larger perspective. And in the chat, somebody mentioned how the United States was preventing Jewish immigration after World War II, which of course was one of the main reasons why Holocaust victims in many cases petitioned very strongly for the right to go to Israel. Now, Israel at this point also had to create a regional center of power because they couldn't necessarily work within the the Cold War framework. They couldn't be assured that it would be able to protect them. And the Middle East doesn't have any single state that's powerful enough to take on all the other states. So Middle Eastern states typically form alliances, and Israel managed to form in 1949 the Alliance of the Periphery, which was an alliance between Israel, Turkey, and Iran. It was called the Periphery because these are the three predominantly non-Arab states in the Middle Eastern region other than Cyprus, which was still under British rule at this point. And during this period, Arab socialism was incredibly powerful. It was a galvanizing influence throughout the Islamic world, primarily because of Nasser's ability to communicate effectively with the Arab population. As I pointed out in the episode on Arab socialism, Gamal Abdel Nasser used the radio to great effect. He created a number of radio stations, especially Sawt al-Arab, the voice of the Arabs. And on that radio station, he began to apply the concept of Arab socialism, the idea that nationalism from the West would be pushed out, that every Egyptian would be able to get a job, that Egyptians would be the determiners of their own fate, and that Arabs altogether should unite, and this was incredibly potent. He based the legitimacy of Arab socialism on its ability to thwart the desires of foreign powers, and Israel was seen as a projection of those foreign powers in the Middle Eastern region. Accordingly, Israel's survival or Israel's fall would be seen as being a question of the legitimacy of the pan-Arab movement, of the Arab socialist movement. So, separate from this, we should also discuss the other minority communities within the State of Israel who are not Jews and not Palestinians. And the first one that I really want to introduce are the Bedouins. Now, Sultan al-Atrash, who you can see on the right-hand side, is a Syrian Druze. And in fact, this is one of the slides that I used during my discussion of Syria, but it's very appropriate here. The Druze as a minority are ethnically Arab, but they don't see themselves as the same population as the Muslim or Christian Arabs among whom they live. Druze is a post-Islamic religion, and if you go back to episode 1, I discuss some of the differences between Druze and other people who would be more traditionally considered Muslims. But why was it that the Druze had a tension with the other Muslim population, the other Arab populations, both Muslim and Christian? The tension was the historical role that they had played in the Arab world. Druze tended to be landowners, and Muslims and Christians in the region tended to be sharecroppers. And so this was a relationship of a feudal nature, which put the Druze often on the opposite side of the Muslims and the Christians. Now, the Muslims and the Christians within the mandatory Mandate of Palestine would eventually become the Palestinians. Both the Muslims and the Christians associate with that identity. The Druze did not. And so they have a very different relationship with the State of Israel because they didn't necessarily see it as antithetical to their historic position in society. Another group that we need to talk about are the Circassians. Now, the Circassians are few in number. Today, there's about 4,000 Circassians in Israel. Contrast that with a Jewish population in the state of around 6.5 million. So the Circassians are only in the Middle East because of the Tzitzikun, or the Circassian genocide, and we covered that in episode 27. But as a result of that genocide, about 700,000 Circassians fled to predominantly what's today Turkey, but also to other countries in the Middle East. And they had a reputation of being incredibly warlike and incredibly effective. Accordingly, many of the Arab leaders in the 19th century put the Circassian towns and cities where they permitted them to settle in areas where there would be intense conflict, so they could serve effectively as emissaries of the state. In fact, if you look at the first picture, the Circassians in Jordan are still held at that sort of high status, and they maintain a strong affiliation with the Jordanian monarchy because of that historic relationship where they would effectively be the policemen and bodyguards of their new countries. So, because of this, the Druze in 1956 and the Circassians a little bit later argued that the Israeli state, which drafted Jews as a matter of course, both men and women, argued that their population should also be drafted into the Israeli military for the defense of the state that they both owned. Now, Druze and Circassians had both served on the Israeli side in the War of Independence, but in negligible numbers. In the later conflicts, because of the draft, they served in significantly greater numbers. The Druze in Israel were originally organized into their own unique battalion called the Cherev Battalion, or the Sword Battalion. There was increasing pressure within Israel to integrate them into the Jewish units and to stop having religiously affiliated units with respect to the Druze, given how much sacrifice the Druze had made, and also how decorated the Cherev battalion was. And so Druze at this point, in modern times, are part and parcel of the traditional Israeli military, which is Jewish dominant. The Circassian soldiers have almost exclusively been in such units because there haven't been as many of them. Remember, there's only 4,000 Circassians in Israel. In contrast, there's probably close to 150,000 Druze. So One of the developments that's been going on more recently is that ethnic Palestinian citizens of Israel, Christians and Muslims, who are Arab, have begun to enlist as well. And because this enlistment is relatively small, those units are resegregated. And so those units generally serve under Israeli Jewish commanders, but are primarily non-Jewish combatants. There is one other group of Israelis that we should point out, and it's one other group that resisted to associate with the Palestinian identity because of the historical relationship between the Christians and the Muslims and this population. The Christians and the Muslims that I was talking about earlier when I talked about the Druze were sharecroppers on land, right? They were settled individuals. These were commonly called fallah, or peasants, because they were tied to the land in this way. Another group of Arabs are the Bedouin, or the desert people, who are not tied to land, and so their relationship with the settled people was often antagonistic. In fact, if we go back to the reason about why and where the Circassians were settled, the Circassians were often settled at places where the townships ended and the desert began, to prevent conflict between the Bedouin and the settled Fallah. Accordingly, when Israel was coming into the fore, these Bedouin populations weren't necessarily on board with the Palestinian national process. They certainly didn't see it as a process that included them. And so Bedouin have served as trackers primarily in the Israeli military, and while there is no draft of them, there is a high rate of enlistment. In fact, this enlistment goes back all the way to the beginning of the state. If you looked at on the lower right-hand side, you see Abd al-Majid al-Haidar. Abd al-Majid was one of the highest ranking commanders in the Israeli military during the War of Independence. And for those who don't recognize his name, that's because most Israelis refer to him by his Hebrew nom de guerre, a name that he used himself, which was Amos Yarkoni. It was actually a huge scandal when he died in 1991, and there was difficulty in figuring out a way to bury him in the National Military Cemetery because of requirements that Jews and non-Jews not be buried together. But the outcry was not that he was going to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, but that he was not going to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, given how much he'd given to the state of Israel. And so they found a compromise solution that would allow him to be in the cemetery, but at the same time, not technically inside of it for the rules of Jewish law. So as we move into the 50s, we start seeing altercations with Egypt because of Nasser's promulgation of Arab nationalism and his antagonism towards the West. This comes to a head in 1956 when Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal from the British and the French and denies Israel the right to ship goods through the canal, which was in violation of the treaty requirements for any canal, is that all civilian ships must be allowed to pass. So you have this situation. UK and France were angered because Egypt, by nationalizing the canal, had taken away property that they had owned. It had been British and French citizens and through the British and French government that owned the canal, and this expropriation was a loss of their monetary profits. So they colluded with Israel to invade Egypt. However, the United States came very quickly and said that the British and the French should stand down, and they did, but the Israelis refused to stand down, and they launched an invasion of their own of the Sinai Peninsula. Eisenhower made the first U.S. large-scale intervention in the region. Now, as others have pointed out, the United States had not had a terribly friendly relationship with Israel prior to this. And one thing that I hadn't mentioned is that during the Independence War, the U.S. had an arms embargo on the entire region. So Israel had been trying to at least court some degree of American favor, but Eisenhower dashed that dream for at least the 1950s. He argued that all American investment in Israel, which Pinchas Sapir and others had been trying to collect, would be withdrawn if Israel did not evacuate the Sinai Peninsula. And so, not wanting to offend the Americans and not wanting to lose the economic momentum that they had, they'd actually been growing the economy at a stellar pace during the 1950s. the Israelis withdrew from the Suez and withdrew back to the Israeli borders. The UN, in turn, put peacekeepers in the region, and Nasser declared victory because even though his soldiers hadn't been able to repel Israel from the territory, he was able to keep his canal nationalized, and he was able to use diplomacy to force the Israelis to withdraw. Now, Eisenhower defended Nasser's nationalization of the canal primarily because of his opposition to imperialism, and he saw the British and French control of the canal as a form of imperialism. Surprisingly, he doesn't seem to have thought the American control of the Panama Canal to have been a similar form of imperialism. One of the other things that I wanted to draw attention to here is that the Iraqi regime at that time, which was a monarchy, the Hashemite monarchy, was trying desperately to gain favor with its own citizens, who were increasingly desirous of an Arab socialist revolt like what had happened in Egypt. So Iraqi soldiers moved into positions in the West Bank, near Jenin, for example, in order to show that they were going to be just as supportive of Nasser if a war came to it. Of course, those tanks never actually went anywhere, and the Iraqi government collapsed under a coup d'etat in 1958. So between 1957 and 1967, Nasser becomes even more belligerent, more bellicose, and declares that eventually he will win a war against the Israelis. Of course, he doesn't call it the Israelis, he calls it the Zionist entity at that point. And at the same time, the Israeli government had been trying to cultivate a better relationship with the Americans. You can see there Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and US President Lyndon B. Johnson. The Six-Day War really showed that Israel was more than capable of pursuing a war against the Arabs, and it's an incredibly difficult feat of engineering that they managed to maintain because their air force was only strong enough to attack one enemy at a given time. Their land forces were only strong enough to attack one enemy at a given time, but because of the disjointed response from the different Arab governments, Israel was able to spend 2 days taking out Egypt, 2 days taking out Jordan, and then 2 days taking out Syria. And you can see the number of Egyptian prisoners taken by the Israelis. It was an incredibly humiliating defeat. And the Arabs had a declaration in Khartoum that said, among many things, no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. So let's go through this war in a little bit of slow motion, because a lot of people overestimate or misunderstand what happened in this war. This war was what was called a preemptive war, meaning that Israel declared war first, believing that war would come to Israel eventually. And they used as justification for that war that they would be cut off from international trade through the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, if you see, Israel has a small outlet onto the Gulf of Aqaba. This outlet continues into the Red Sea, and then that can go through around Saudi Arabia to Iran. Now, we have to remember at this point, because it's counterintuitive today, Iran was the primary ally of the State of Israel and the primary oil supplier of the State of Israel in the region. So any action here that would cut off Israeli access to Iran would be putting Israel in a difficult position from a military perspective, because without sufficient petroleum, they couldn't win a war. And that's exactly what Egypt did. These islands here were at that time controlled by the Egyptian government, and the Egyptians blockade that region starting in May of 1967. That blockade served as Israel's casus belli, and because of that, Israel then took the first attack against Egypt. And what they did was try to achieve air superiority. From the position of the Israeli generals, if Israel had air superiority, they would be able to effectively control all the different theaters of the war, because while land forces are difficult to move on a dime, planes can be moved very quickly. So the first thing that they did was they bombed the Egyptian tarmac and destroyed 2/3 of the Egyptian Air Force. With that, the Egyptians, which were the only Arab country with a significant air force, were effectively without cover. The second thing is that the Israelis had analyzed the topography of the Sinai Peninsula, both during that year that they were there before they were pushed out by Eisenhower, and based on other photographs. They discovered that there were numerous sand traps and pits, areas that were mountainous and hard to traverse. You can see the topography, it's very high in certain points. And so they knew the exact routes that they wanted to drive their tanks over. The Egyptian response at a governmental level to the Israeli tank invasion was very similar to the Macaulay Culkin image that I have on the right-hand side. The Egyptian tank commanders did not have a clear and coherent response. They didn't know the terrain. There's a joke in Egypt that the Israelis were preparing to win the war, and the Egyptians were preparing for the parade after the war. A parade, of course, which did not happen. But these tank commanders, because they had no clear idea about how to retreat, just told their tanks to retreat in any way possible. And this resulted in the worst possible outcome for the Egyptians. A number of their tanks got stranded in sands that can't allow a tank to move forward. Some of them tipped over. And of course, because the Israeli Air Force was unchallenged in the skies, significant numbers of Egyptian tanks were napalmed. It was a crushing defeat for the Egyptians, and many Egyptian fighters in the tank corps still say to this day that they didn't have the opportunity to fight. They didn't have the opportunity to actually contest the Israelis because their own orders were what did them in. There's a question, do you think this was an information war as much as an actual war? Mossad probably had the best intelligence. There's certainly a degree to which this is an intelligence war, in the sense of what are the other sides doing and thinking. And we're going to see the intelligence side of it in Syria. In Syria, that's much more important. Mossad argued that it was very easy for them to get agents into Egypt, and it was very easy for them to get agents into Jordan. In fact, the US-Jordanian relationship and the British-Jordanian relationship, which was almost always positive, meant that Jordan and Israel actually had a number of underground channels through which they passed information, even before the normalization of relations. In fact, one of the things that we talked about in episode 57 was that King Abdullah I of Jordan, before he was assassinated, was secretly trying to come to a peace agreement of some kind with the Israelis. So, from an intelligence perspective, Israel had a significant amount of information about what was going on in Egypt. And in Jordan and Syria, it was more difficult. And that's why there's the whole story of Eli Cohen, which we're going to get to. But the bigger thing than just the intelligence was the planning. Israel planned this war for 5 years. The Arabs did not plan this war at all. And that's really where the difference comes in terms of how the war was executed. Now, one of the things that Nasser did was that he told the Jordanians that he was winning while he was clearly losing. And this led the Jordanians to declare war on Israel on the 7th of June. So 2 days after the first hostilities began on the 5th of June. Now, we should remember that before the war, Jerusalem was a divided city. I couldn't find a good map that showed the divided city as it was. But if you follow that area that's sort of that light blue, you can see that area that Israel controlled, and the entire surrounding area was controlled by the Jordanians, including the old city. And so you can see in the picture on the right-hand side, Jordanian soldiers actually on the Jaffa gate of the old city with weapons bearing down on Israeli civilians. And that was pretty much the position from 1949 to 1967. Now, Jordan had annexed the West Bank to its territory, although that annexation wasn't recognized by more than 5 countries. And it had given Jordanian citizenship to most of the Palestinians. So, and we have a question. The Sinai was part of Egypt. Why were its tank commanders lacking in knowledge of how to fight in it effectively? They just never studied it. They never thought that it was worthwhile to actually chart all of the different paths through the Sinai, which areas were areas that had no outlet, which areas were more mountainous. The Sinai is an underpopulated area of Egypt, and an area that Egypt has failed to really examine from a geostrategic point of view. the Israelis took the time to examine that. But back to Jordan. So once the Jordanians declared war on Israel, and Israel sent numerous communiques through those underground channels to tell the Jordanians not to declare war, Israel decided to launch a full force offensive. They launched paratroopers into the old city, and you can see the first paratroopers in Israel who secured the Western Wall, the holiest site in the Jewish religion. And you can see a complementary movement moving from the north that attacked the Iraqi military positions in Jenin. Remember all those Iraqi tanks that were just sort of sitting there in 1956? They were still there, but the Israelis were able to push them out. So you then have this chaotic period over those 2 days in the West Bank, and roughly 300,000 Palestinians tried to flee the West Bank to the East Bank to stay in Jordanian-controlled territory, and the Israelis, to prevent new Jordanian tanks from crossing from the East Bank of the Jordan River, bombed the bridges. So you can see these. This is a demolished bridge that the Israelis have destroyed to prevent those tanks from coming over, and the Palestinians are using whatever ropes and connections they have to continue to make their way across the river. Now, those people who have seen the Jordan River, and you can sort of see it from this picture, the Jordan River isn't actually that deep. The reason why tanks can't cross the Jordan River is that the two sides of the river have very steep banks, and so a tank simply cannot come up the bank and over, which made it an effective tank wall, and that led the Jordanians to declare an armistice, only controlling the east side of the Jordan River. On the Syrian side, you have the question of Syrian intelligence. And Eli Cohen was an Israeli. He was born in Egypt to a Mizrahi family. And because of his ability to speak Arabic and his ability to fake a Syrian accent, he was actually able to get into the higher levels of the Syrian government. And we're going to talk about this when we talk about Syria in the 1960s. Syria in the 1960s was an incredibly unstable place from an internal perspective. Syria had something like 9 coups d'etats between the year 1946 and the year 1970. So, in fact, in 1949, they had 3 in a row. So you can imagine just how unstable and how difficult it was from a Syrian perspective to trust anybody else in the political establishment, given how many people were likely to attack. Eli Cohen's personality was such that he was able to befriend one group of people in the government, and then eventually that group took control, and so he maintained that friendship and relationship until he was outed as a spy in 1965. One of his most important contributions, it's believed, is that he gave the idea of planting eucalyptus trees over the positions that the Syrians held in the Golan Heights. Now you can see the Syrian position in the Golan Heights is substantially topographically higher than the positions in the Israeli-held Galilee. And so that march up the mountains would be incredibly difficult. The Israelis also knew that the Syrians had put mines in many of the ways up the mountain. So only certain paths could be taken. And the guns that the Syrians had built into the side of the mountain were quite secure and difficult to find. But by Eli Cohen saying that eucalyptus trees should be planted over all those places, justifying it based on the fact that the Syrians shouldn't be in the sun all day, the Israelis now knew everywhere where an eucalyptus tree stood was a place where an ensconced battle gun or position was placed. And so the Israelis could directly target those from the air and with their tanks, and within one day actually get to the height of the Golan and begin to press on the eastern side of that heights where the Syrian territory begins to dip a little bit. So we then come after the war to the administration of the West Bank. The war was ended with UN Security Council Resolution 242, and that security resolution left the status of the territories that Israel had acquired during the war, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, as territories in a sort of limbo. The UNSC resolution made 2 requirements. The first requirement was that the Arab states make peace with Israel and all states of belligerency. And it made a second requirement that Israel return these occupied territories. In fact, all of these is a huge political debate because of the French translation of the UN document. The Israelis argue that the peace treaties should happen first, and the land should be returned as a result of the peace treaty. The Arabs argue that the land should be returned first, and the peace treaties will follow as a result of the land being turned over. Generally speaking, when it came to Egypt and Jordan, it seemed that the Israeli approach was the one that won out. But Syria and Lebanon continue to adhere to the other approach. Regardless, Israel now had these territories under its control that the Arab states did not want to take back. And they didn't want to take them back because that would require making peace with Israel, which they had agreed in Khartoum with those 3 no's that they were not going to do. So Israel now had to put these territories under military occupation. And so there became a question as to how exactly that was going to work. And especially when it came to the West Bank. When it came to the Golan and to the Sinai, you had areas with very little remaining population. Most of the Egyptian and Syrian populations who would live there had fled. And while a few Israelis wanted to move there and create settlements, there was no real fear that this would disrupt the local population. There was also no real fear that this territory would be difficult for Israelis to pull out of if they would need to, because these areas had no religious significance. By contrast, the West Bank is the traditional homeland of ancient Judea, right? The historical homeland of the Jewish people. Almost all of the traditional Jewish religious sites are in the West Bank. And so there was a religious desire by many to go into the West Bank and live there. So you then had this question of how were you going to permit that or not permit that? And the Israeli government decided to invoke the Ottoman Land Code. Now, if you go back, this was in episode 26, where we discussed the Ottoman Land Code of 1858. And in the Ottoman Land Code of 1858, there was what was called the Arazimavet, or the Deadlands. And under Ottoman law, if territory had not been demonstrated to be owned by the state, it had not been demonstrated to be owned by a private person, it had not been demonstrated to be owned by an Islamic land trust or a waqf, and it had not been demonstrated to be communal property, then it was a deadland with a reverter to the state. And so the Israeli government deemed significant portions of the West Bank roughly analogous with this Area C. It's not the same, but it's roughly analogous to be those deadlands, and therefore had a reverter to the Israeli state. And accordingly, the Israeli government could convert those territories into territories that it could resell or permit settlement on to Israeli Jewish populations. And this begins the situation of the Israeli Jewish settlers. At that point, you only have a few tens of thousands that begin to move out. But as the Israeli population increases and more people become religious Zionists, we'll talk about that next week, you're going to see the numbers increase to the point where today we have roughly 300,000 settlers in the West Bank and 200,000 settlers in East Jerusalem, which is the part of Jerusalem that was under Jordanian occupation from 1949 to 1967. After the Six-Day War, in terms of international politics, the Egyptians were not willing to accept their loss of the Sinai and began a war of attrition from the West Bank of the Sinai, which they controlled, against the Israeli-controlled East Bank of the Sinai. To assist in this, the Egyptians furthered and deepened their alliance with the Soviet Union, which began to send Soviet advisors who actively participated in this war of attrition. The war of attrition actually killed more Israelis than had died in the Six-Day War, but it was over a very slow span of time. Every day, one missile, one attack, a few dead. And so it wasn't large enough for Israel to declare a full-out war. And also Israel didn't want to go directly against the Soviet Union in war. And so you had this sort of dragging out for those 3 years. There's a point, Wikipedia says that there is about 450,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and that does not include Israelis in East Jerusalem. I might be using an older number than they're using, because the number I saw was 500,000 total, 300 and 200, but the number may well have risen in that time. All right, so we also see a number of Israeli protections. The Bar-Lev line was created by Israeli strategians to try and create a defense against these constant bombardments by Egypt and Soviet officials. A number of Soviet soldiers also died in this conflict, and eventually their withdrawal in 1970 resulted in Egypt suspending the war. The war also calmed down because Gamal Abdel Nasser himself died in 1970. Another one of the strange post-war situations was the Battle of Karame. We're beginning to see here the formation of Palestinian organizations. In particular, in 1964, Yasser Arafat becomes the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and that organization begins to promote the Fida'i attacks against Israel from now bases on the Jordanian east bank of the river. So in 1968, the Israelis decide that they're going to launch an invasion of Karame, the town in Jordan where he is believed to be, in order to extricate him. This war goes very poorly for the Israelis and very well for the Jordanians. While the Israelis were successful from a tactical perspective, they were able to take the towns that they wanted to take. Yasser Arafat was not captured, and they sustained significant material and personnel casualties that they had not been expecting. It's believed by many that this act salvaged the reputation of King Hussein, who at that point was increasingly seen as a pro-Western leader and therefore unfit in the Arab world that was moving towards Arab socialism. But it was demonstrated here that he actually was able to defeat Israel in a way that Egypt could not. All right. The last major Arab-Israeli war is the war in 1973. And this war was a surprise to the Israelis. Their intelligence did not note that this war was going to happen. And it actually led to Golda Meir, the prime minister of Israel at the time, losing significant political clout because of how surprised she was. The war was initiated by Egyptians who built a bridge over the Sinai Canal using a number of pontoons in Operation Badr, and in that were able to make territory on the east bank of the Suez in Egyptian hands. At the same time, Syrians led an invasion of the Golan Heights, but Israel in a few days was able to repulse both of these and encircle an entire division of Egyptian troops on the Egyptian side of the border, as well as begin marching on Damascus by the time a ceasefire was signed. The fact that the Egyptians were able to secure key victories in the first days of the war allowed the Arabs to cast this as an Arab victory, despite the fact that they had not been able to hold on to any land gains, and despite the fact that Israel was advancing at the end of the war. So we start to see, as we get towards the end of the 1960s and into the beginning of the 1970s, the formation of a clear Palestinian Arab identity. That's not to say that Palestinians didn't call themselves Palestinians before. We've talked about how the term Palestinian was first used in 1911 to refer to the Arabs in the Al-Falastin newspaper, how Khalil Baidas in the 1890s used the term Palestinian as an ethnic term. But the idea of a distinct Palestinian people didn't have common currency until the 1960s. And it comes directly out of the relationship between both Israel and its treatment of its settled Arab minority, and also the Arab states and their treatment of the Arab minorities. In Gaza, the Egyptians created a Palestinian government that was a puppet government responsive to them in Cairo. And you can see they even issued passports of this all-Palestine government that was operated based in Gaza. You also see the refugee camps, and the Arabs refuse to allow these Palestinian populations to integrate with their local population. Some, like Lebanon, use the excuse that their population demographics are a very complex situation. And so introducing the Palestinians would have altered the demographic situation and provoked a civil war. Eventually, that does happen anyway, but that's Lebanon's argument. Syria, Jordan, and Egypt don't open up these camps under the argument that the Palestinians should be repatriated to their homes, and therefore they shouldn't be allowed to assimilate into the countries in which they live. This has, of course, resulted in Palestinians being refugees who give birth to refugees, a situation that no other refugee community in the world has. All right, so that gets us to the end of our presentation for today, but we will continue where we left off next week, talking about Israel as we move into the modern period. So while you're getting your questions, comments, and clarifications together, let me tell you a little bit about who we are as a group. So this is Middle Eastern Islamic History. I am Richard Sassoon, and we meet on Wednesdays at 7. Next week, we're going to continue with Israel and bring it up to the present day. We have a number of other series that on our channel, like Jason Peng's Asian Philosophy. Aaron and I periodically do an episode on European Union security. We just had an episode from Dead Languages from John Maloney on Hebrew, the biblical form of Hebrew. Jane and John do Powerful Women in Dead Languages every month. And there are a number of short-run series like our coverage of the Russo-Ukrainian War. And we should get back to that probably in April or May. And we have a number of older series that you can see on our YouTube page. So the link for that is down below. There are several questions here. Do you recommend any good books on Israeli-Palestinian history? I often find that every book is to one side or the other, so it's best to read them all together. I like Avi Shlaim as an author. I think he does a really good job. I like Eli Podeh for his book on the peace treaties that Israel was not able to consummate. I forget the name of the book, but it's really helpful for understanding the Israeli mental command. Another book that I would recommend more on the Palestinian side, as opposed to the history stuff, I like the Palestinian poetry. So Tawfiq Ziad, I would read him. I would read Mahmoud Darwish. Both of their poems really cover sort of the Palestinian mentality. And that's actually a lot more important than any particular battles or history that the Palestinians want to talk about. There's a question of, can you watch the previous talks? Where are they available? They are literally available on the YouTube page that you can see right there. There's a question as to what my personal background is. I'm a lawyer by training. My family is from Baghdad. We were among those Jews who left between 50 and 52. There's a question as to whether we could discuss the US-Chinese relationship. I know a bit about China. I don't know enough to do a series on it. But I would say that the US-Chinese relationship has several major points since World War II. World War II, of course, US and China were allies fighting the Japanese, and that created a certain appreciation between the two sides. That said, the victory of the communists led to the United States recognizing only the government in Taiwan as the legitimate government of China until 1972. In 1972, as Mao was breaking away from the Soviet Union in terms of their relationship, he turned to the United States and began to facilitate relations with the United States. So that's Nixon's meeting with Zhou Enlai, and then that improves Chinese access to the West. During that period from 49 to 72, China has an incredibly dark history that we're talking about: the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the many serious famines and other issues. Then from 1972 until 1978, you have the death throes of Mao's government. And following that, you have the reign of Deng Xiaoping, who reorients China's economy to make it a more capitalist economy. And this facilitates the relationship with the United States and turns China into a large-scale manufacturing place. That relationship improves and China begins to become more open until 1989, when it becomes clear that China will not liberalize in the political sphere, even though it's willing to liberalize in the economic sphere. And so the United States becomes a little bit more skeptical of China at that point. From 1989 until about 2013 or so, you have the governments of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, which are relatively favorable towards the United States. And that period was actually the best period for China economically, and relations with the United States were relatively positive. Large-scale trade, primarily low-level technology being produced in China sent to the West, and massive importer of Western food, especially American sorghum and soy. Then, with the election of Xi Jinping, China has been moving back into the direction of Mao and becoming more isolationist, more state control, and the relationship with the United States is accordingly souring. This was, of course, accelerated by the Trump-caused and Biden-supported trade war with China. So I think that sort of covers it generally. If, as I said, I don't have enough for an episode, but yeah. All right. Then the next question is, did I discuss Nasser putting Egyptian Jews into concentration camps in the desert? I didn't discuss it, but it certainly happened, especially in 56. One of the issues that Egypt had with the Jewish community of Egypt is that it appeared that the Mossad had connections to it, especially among the Karaite Jewish community. And that's where you have the Lavon affair, where the Israeli government incentivized Karaite Jews to perform a militant attack within Egypt. Now, what Nasser did is that he decided that every Jew in Egypt would be put in camps, or they would be allowed to flee. And that pretty much ended Egypt's Jewish community. There's a question of, was my family involved in helping Jewish immigration in Shanghai? Yes, my family was involved in that. Not my direct ancestors, other branches of the family. So any connection between your family and the Sassoon Codex? I'm not quite sure what that is. There are parts of my family that are part of Sassoon & Co. And otherwise, no. Did I live in Israel? I've been to Israel. I've never lived there. All right. I think, well, I really appreciate all the thanks. And I'm glad that you guys enjoyed what's going on. I see a comment about Netanyahu. My personal issue with Netanyahu's leadership at this point is that is the same point that's being made throughout the American media, is that basically he's trying to change the Israeli judiciary to prevent the Israeli judiciary from finding him guilty of corruption. So he's basically being corrupt to do an endgame on corruption. There's the argument being made in pro-Netanyahu media that this is a democratization of the High Court of Israel, because it would require more of because it's a semi-privatized committee that appoints the chief justices in Israel. And part of that committee is standing justices. Part of that committee is made of civil society. Part of it's made from members of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. But the thing is that the parliament in Israel has both executive and legislative power. So if they have full control over appointing the judiciary effectively becomes the rubber stamp of the Knesset. And so you don't really have checks and balances. And that's what that argument really fails to miss. But it often talks about the idea that the people should be responsible for the choosing of the judges, and the legislature is voted on by the people. So it would be a direct layer of doing that. But effectively, it removes the check of government. And in countries like the United States, the executive and the legislature are not fused. And so you have checks that way, even though the legislature and executive are responsible for appointing the judiciary. All right. So I think that covers everything. There's a question of where can I find the videos on the Russo-Ukrainian war. That's also on the same YouTube channel. Just look under the playlist for the Ukrainian war, and you'll find all those videos. There are 7 or 8 of those now, where we go through different stages of the war. All right, so thank you everybody for coming, and I'm going to close it out unless there are further questions.